Hello and welcome back. Or welcome if you're new. This is No Wonder, a show where we discuss all topics that are related to womanhood at large, while existing in a patriarchal society. In this episode, we'll be looking at ecofeminism, a movement that started in the 1970s and that has since evolved into a complex, multifaceted philosophy with a wide range of influences and applications. The roots of ecofeminism can be traced back to the movements of the 60s and the 70s of environmentalism that started raising awareness about the impact of industrialization and consumerism on the natural world. Think of the hippies, for example, or of the celebration of the first Earth Day in the 60s. However, as you can probably imagine from the name, ecofeminism also draws on feminist critiques of patriarchal systems of power and oppression. Ecofeminists argue that there is a deep connection between the oppression of women and the degradation of the natural world, and that both stem from a mindset of domination and control. They also believe that men's domination over women is an extension of their domination over nature itself. But also, this domination is not only harmful to women, but to the environment as well. We'll see all of this more in detail throughout the episode, but first, let's come back a few steps. The environmental movement of the 60s and the 70s were social and political movements that emerged in response to concerns about the impact of industrialization and consumerism. During this period, people became increasingly aware of the damages caused by pollution, deforestation, and other forms of destruction. The environmentalist movement was largely influenced by Rachel Carson's groundbreaking book titled Silent Spring, published in 1962. Rachel Carson was an American marine biologist, writer, and conservationist. A conservationist, if you don't know, is someone who is actively involved in the protection and preservation of natural resources, ecosystems, and wildlife. Conservationists may also be involved in a wide range of issues, including protecting endangered species, preserving forests and other habitats, reducing pollution, or promoting sustainable agriculture and fishing practices. Mrs. Carson is widely regarded as one of the most important environmentalists of the 20th century, and Silent Spring is considered a landmark in the history of environmentalism. In this book, she exposes the harmful effects of pesticides on the environment, specifically on birds and other wildlife. Its title refers to the silence that would result from the elimination of the bird populations due to the widespread use of pesticides. In her book, Carson argued that the indiscriminate use of chemicals poses significant threats to human and earth health, and advocates for a more responsible and sustainable approaches to pest control. In the years that followed, this movement grew in strength and visibility, with organizations such as Greenpeace, Friends of the Earth, and Sierra Club becoming prominent voices for environmental advocacy. The movement also led to the creation of regulations and policies, such as the Clean Air Act and the Clean Water Act in the United States. As you can imagine, this movement is also closely linked to other social and political movements of the era, such as the civil rights movement and the anti-war movement, because many activists saw the fight for environmental protection as part of a larger struggle for social justice and human rights. Overall, it played a crucial role in raising awareness about the need for environmental protection and conservation, and laid the groundwork for many of the environmental policies and regulations that exist today. But let's go back to ecofeminism. Some of the early pioneers of ecofeminism include writers such as Vandana Shiva, Maria Myers, and Carolyn Merchant, who all argued that the exploitation of nature and women are linked in a system of global capitalism. Let's see all of these three authors in detail. Vandana Shiva is an Indian scholar. She is known for her advocacy of seed sovereignty and sustainable agriculture, and her work to promote ecological and social justice. Shiva has written extensively on the links between environmental degradation, economic globalization, and social inequality, arguing that all of these issues are interconnected and we must address them as a whole. She's also a vocal critic of corporate control over natural resources and the impact on communities of neoliberal economic policies. By the way, neoliberal economic policies are a set of principles of the economy and policies that prioritize free market capitalism, deregulation, and the reduction of government intervention in the economy. The second author that I mentioned is Maria Mayes, and she is a German feminist and ecofeminist who wrote on the links between capitalism, patriarchy, and environmental deterioration. She has argued that the exploitation of women and nature are both part of a larger system of exploitation that lays under global capitalism. And we must challenge this system in order to create a just world. Mayes is also known for her work on the concept of subsistence, that refers to the minimum amount of resources required for basic survival, and for her thoughts on the importance of valuing the labor of women and marginalized communities. The third author is Carolyn Merchant. She is an American historian and ecofeminist who has written extensively on the history of environmentalism and the links between gender and nature. In her book, The Death of Nature, Women, Ecology, and the Scientific Revolution, Merchant argues that the scientific revolution of the 16th and 17th centuries is accompanied by a shift in the way we view nature. It went from a nurturing mother to a passive machine there to be exploited. And she also argues that this shift came with a switch in the way we saw women in our society. They went from being powerful beings with connections to the natural world to passive objects to be controlled. Merchant also continued to write on these topics, emphasizing the importance of valuing the interconnections between humans and nature, and that we should challenge the system of domination that underpin environmental decay. One of the key areas of focus for ecofeminism today that we briefly saw in the description of the authors is environmental justice. Ecofeminists recognize that marginalized communities, in particular people of color and low-income communities, are often the most affected by environmental degradation and climate change. As such, ecofeminists are actively involved in campaigns and movements that seek to address these environmental injustices and to protect the rights for those most impacted. We also saw this idea of environmental justice in episode number 4, if I'm not mistaken, where we talk about how women are generally more impacted or impacted more severely than men by the effects of climate change. I highly encourage you to go check it out if you're interested. Ecofeminists also try to promote sustainable living practices to reduce environmental harm and to promote social equity. Some examples may be sustainable agriculture, reducing waste and consumption, and promote renewable energy resources. In addition, ecofeminism today recognizes the importance of intersectionality to address the root causes of oppression. This involves understanding the ways in which environmental degradation, gender oppression, racism, colonialism, and all of the other forms of discrimination are interconnected. I'm sure that by now you are wondering what are the scientific bases behind this philosophy. I've done some research and I found 3 points that I'm going to bring you today. The first one is interconnectedness, as we just briefly saw. Ecofeminism recognizes the interconnectedness of humans and nature. And it is supported by research in the field of environmental psychology that shows that people's well-being is intimately connected to the health of the natural environment they're living in. Exposure to nature can have positive effects on mental health, cognitive functioning, and physical health. Inversely, environmental degradation can have negative effects on the same domains. I'll bring you a couple of examples of this relation to be more clear. Exposure to natural environments such as parks and forests is associated with decreased level of stress, anxiety, and depression, as well as improved mood and cognitive functioning, according to a study published in the International Journal of Environmental Research and Public Health. Another study, published by the American Journal of Preventive Medicine, found also that living in areas with more green spaces is associated with lower levels of obesity and chronic diseases such as diabetes and heart disease. Inversely, there is also evidence that environmental degradation has negative effects on mental health, cognitive functioning, and physical health. But I think that we can all think of an example that we've been told growing up, but I'll bring you some more examples. Exposure to air pollution is associated with decreased cognitive functioning in older adults, according to a study published in the Lancet Planetary Health. Another study published in the International Journal of Epidemiology also found that exposure to noise pollution is associated with increased risk of depression and anxiety. And lastly, the one that we all, I think, kind of know, is how environmental degradation can have negative effects on physical health, such as increased risk of respiratory diseases, cancer, or other illnesses. The second point, I'm afraid some of my listeners won't like it, are the relationship with gender roles and the environment. Because ecofeminism recognizes the way in which gender roles and socialization contributes to environmental degradation. In fact, research has shown that men are more likely to engage in environmentally harmful behaviors than women, and that traditional gender roles can reinforce attitudes and behaviors that contribute to environmental harm. For example, and I know some of you may not like it, but men are statistically more likely to prefer activities that consume more resources, such as driving larger cars or eating more meat. The third point is environmental justice that we briefly saw. Ecofeminism recognizes its importance, and it is supported by research in the field of environmental sociology, since studies have shown the disproportionate effect of climate change on communities of color and low income, and that this is often due to systemic discrimination and neglect. The research supports the ecofeminist belief that environmental harm is linked to social inequality, and that we must address both in order to create a more just and sustainable world. There are several sub-branches of these movements, including vegetarian ecofeminism, spiritual ecofeminism, and materialist ecofeminism. But at their root, they all assert that masculine dominance has led to a disconnect between nature and culture, which has adversely affected marginalized groups as well as nature itself. For the following of the podcast, remember the word disconnect. I'm gonna come to it later. Now, I'm sure that a bigger question has popped up in your head, asking yourself the relationship between ecofeminism and the animal world. Do ecofeminists eat animals? To answer this question, I found an article from 1991 titled Ecofeminism and the Eating of Animals. The article shows that the philosophy of ecofeminism should reject the logic of domination that justifies killing animals, since a truly gynocentric way of being is being in harmony with Earth and in harmony with your body. And this obviously doesn't include killing animals. But ecofeminism also brings this even further through the process of identification. Let me explain identification. It means that the relationship with animals are redefined. They're no longer seen as instruments, but as beings who deserve to live and toward whom we should act respectively, if not out of friendship. An argument is that humans have failed to understand what it means to be a being, and to recognize that animals also possess intrinsic values and have experiences and emotions similar to ours. Therefore, ecofeminists, to argue for animal rights, often try to draw upon personal experience of empathies with animals. For example, witnessing the suffering of animals in factory farming or the entertainment industries. And this has the intention of leading individuals to recognize that animals are capable of feeling pain and suffering, just like humans do. It is believed that the traditional human-centered worldview, which places humans at the top of value hierarchy, is essentially flawed and fails to acknowledge the worth of other beings. Ecofeminists therefore argue that we must move beyond simply granting legal rights to animals and recognize their intrinsic value of beings. Ecofeminists also do recognize that the patriarchal philosophy has negative effects that must be identified and addressed, because the relationship between meat eating and environmental disaster is measurable, and our meat advocacy culture has successfully separated the consequences of eating animals from the experience of eating animals. And here comes the disconnect I was mentioning before. Because the failure of considering the consequences results from a dualism that characterizes patriarchal culture. In fact, consumption is experienced separately from production, and production is valued over maintenance. The author of the paper that I mentioned before is probably meaning with what I'm saying here that this is a result of fetishization of commodities that is associated with capitalist production. And now we see consumption as an end in itself, and we do not consider what have been the means to that end. I'll bring you an example to clarify. When you're eating a dead chicken, this action is dissociated from the experience of a black woman who, as a lung gunner, must each hour scrape the insides of 5,000 chickens' cavities and pull out the recently slaughtered chicken lungs. In fact, statistically, 95% of all poultry workers are black women who face carpal tunnel syndrome and other disorders caused to repetitive motions. But we do not know any of that, because both women workers and the chicken themselves are means to the end of consumption. But since consumption has been disembodied to our eyes, we don't see the oppression on the workers and their consumable bodies that perish due to the repetitive motions. The end customer doesn't see any of that. And this disembodied production of tangible products is however viewed as a positive indicator for the economy, because it is often associated with increased efficiency, productivity, and profitability. However, the maintenance, hence the actions necessary to sustain the environment, are not measured nor valued. For instance, maintenance of domestic space or environmental space is not currently calculated in economic terms. Housework is not calculated in the gross national product of the United States. The gross national product is the total values of goods and services produced in a country in 1 year. Nor are the environmental resources that we value. We do not measure the negative environmental effects of farming animals to be our food. For example, the cost of our topsoil or our groundwater. Therefore, maintenance of resources is sacrificed to meet consumption. Ecofeminists also point out that women are often relegated to low-paid and low-status jobs in industries such as agriculture, fishing, and food processing, and that they are subject to poor working conditions, long hours, and low wages. This is similar to the exploitation of non-human animals, who are often treated as mere commodities to be exploited for their bodies, such as in the case of factory farming and animal experimentation. Ecofeminists also expand the theory to the process of identification of the oppression and exploitation of women with the exploitation of nature and non-human animals. They argue that patriarchal and capitalist systems have destructive impacts on both of these categories. In this way, ecofeminists also draw parallels between the ways in which women are treated and the way in which non-human animals are treated, particularly in the context of animal agriculture and factory farming. For example, ecofeminists have highlighted the way in which female cows in the dairy industry are repeatedly impregnated and have their calves taken away from them shortly after birth, possibly causing them significant distress and emotional suffering. Ecofeminists here are trying to draw attention to how female animals are often subjected to forced breeding and the theft of their youngs, arguing that these practices are not dissimilar to rape or kidnapping, as they in the end deny the animals' right to bodily autonomy and their reproductive systems. As you can imagine, this philosophy has attracted some criticism, and its biggest criticism comes from the idea of essentialism, or the belief that things have set characteristics. Because some people believe that equating women with nature does reinforce the dichotomy of gender norms that feminism fights to avoid. Some critics argue that ecofeminism relies on essentialist assumptions by attributing inherent qualities to women and nature, which in the end can reinforce stereotypes and overlook the diversity and complexities of both women's experiences and the natural world. Therefore, critics argue that this limits in the end the inclusivity and intersectionality of the movements, because nowadays more and more people are beginning to understand that we each have our own combination of feminine and masculine qualities, whether we are female or male. And the critics is therefore there because they overemphasize gender. Critics argue that ecofeminism tends to prioritize gender as their primary lens, through which they understand and address environmental issues, in the end potentially overshadowing other important factors such as race, class, and the phenomenon of colonialism. They therefore suggest that we should take a more broad and intersectional analysis to fully address the complexity of social and environmental justice. Some critics also argue that ecofeminism can be overly critical of science, technology, and modernization, presenting them as inherently destructive and patriarchal. This suggests that advancements in science and technology can and should contribute to environmental solutions and should not be outright dismissed. Finally, experts argue that ecofeminism often focuses on critique and analysis, without providing after clear and actionable policy proposals for addressing environmental and gender inequalities. Therefore, this can lead to the perception of ecofeminism as lacking in practical solutions and can limit its impact on policymaking. In this podcast episode, we explored the intersection of ecofeminism, animal oppression, and the treatment of women in various industries. We discussed how ecofeminism identifies the parallels between the exploitation of women and of non-human animals, particularly in the context of agriculture and factory farming. Ecofeminism affirms that individuals can change, and in changing, we reposition our relationship with the environment. This form of empowerment is thought to be precisely what is needed in approaching the issues of where animals stand in our lives. Many connections can be made between our food and our environment, our politics and our personal lives. Essentially, what they're saying is that the existence of terminal animals is paradigmatic of, as well as contributing to the inevitability of a terminal Earth. In conclusion, the conversation explored the multifaceted connections between ecofeminism, animal oppression, and the experiences of women, emphasizing the need for an holistic approach to understand and address the systemic inequalities that are presented in our society. That is all for now, but please, if you learned something from this episode, share it to a friend and subscribe. Follow us on TikTok, Instagram, and now also Facebook, but most importantly, keep the conversation going, as I always say. Thank you so much for joining me today, and see you super soon. Bye!